Los Angeles, November 1966. The Beverly Hilton's International Ballroom shimmered under elegant chandeliers as the entertainment industry's most influential figures gathered for the annual Radio Television Transition Awards. 220 of Hollywood's biggest names filled every table, from radio's golden age legends to television's rising stars, all assembled to celebrate the evolution of broadcast entertainment. At table 14 sat Dick Van Dyke, comfortable and confident in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, that warm smile brightening conversations with Mary Tyler Moore, Danny Thomas, and Andy Griffith as they discussed television comedy's incredible momentum. The evening should have been pure celebration for Dick. The Dick Van Dyke Show was dominating television, proving that sophisticated sitcoms could achieve both critical acclaim and massive popular success. Emmy nominations continued pouring in, fan mail overwhelmed his office daily, and Dick had become the undisputed king of television comedy. But across the ballroom, holding court at the head table like a monarch from a bygone era, sat Jack Benny. Jack was radio comedy royalty, the man who had ruled Sunday evenings for over 2 decades with his revolutionary approach to comedy timing and character development. From 1932 to 1955, families across America had gathered around their radios to hear Jack's perfectly crafted jokes, his legendary stinginess, and his interactions with characters like Rochester and Mary Livingstone. He'd been the undisputed king of radio comedy, earning millions and defining what broadcast entertainment could be. But television had changed everything, and Jack was struggling with the transition. While some radio stars like Red Skelton had successfully moved to television, Jack's TV show never quite captured the magic of his radio work. The visual medium seemed to diminish rather than enhance his carefully crafted persona. His ratings were declining, his relevance was questioned, and watching younger performers like Dick Van Dyke achieve the kind of success he'd once enjoyed was eating at him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Jack had been drinking steadily throughout the dinner, his famous comedic timing slightly off, his usual charm replaced by something sharper and more bitter. He'd been listening to conversations about television's bright future, about how the medium was evolving, about how performers like Dick Van Dyke were revolutionizing comedy. Each compliment directed toward the younger generation felt like a personal slight. Each prediction about television's dominance felt like a dismissal of radio's legacy. Dick, meanwhile, was genuinely enjoying the evening. He felt honored to be among entertainment legends, grateful for his success, and excited about television's possibilities. When people mentioned Jack Benny, Dick spoke with deep respect about the older comedian's contributions to broadcast comedy, about how Jack had pioneered character-based humor and revolutionary timing techniques. But Jack interpreted Dick's success differently. What Jack saw was a pretty face who'd benefited from a medium that required less skill than radio, someone who'd achieved fame through visual appeal rather than genuine comedic talent. Dick Van Dyke represented everything Jack felt was wrong with television: style over substance, appearance over ability, easy success over hard-earned mastery. The formal program began at 8:30 with presentations honoring the transition from radio to television. Bob Hope received a standing ovation for his success across both mediums. Burns and Allen were celebrated for their seamless adaptation, and the atmosphere remained warm and celebratory. When Dick was called to present the Excellence in Television Comedy Award, the applause was genuine and enthusiastic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dick began, his voice carrying easily through the elegant ballroom, "tonight we're celebrating something unprecedented in entertainment history. The successful transition from one medium to another, from radio to television." He paused, looking around at faces that had shaped American entertainment for decades. This transition hasn't been easy for anyone. Radio required performers to create entire worlds through voice alone, to paint pictures with words, to make audiences see characters they could only hear. Television asks for something different, combining those vocal skills with physical performance, visual storytelling, and a new kind of intimacy with audiences. Dick's speech was generous and inclusive, acknowledging the challenges faced by radio performers adapting to television. Some of the greatest entertainers in history built their careers in radio, Dick continued. Jack Benny taught us that timing isn't just about when you speak, but about when you don't speak. Red Skelton showed us that characters could live entirely in an audience's imagination. Burns and Allen proved that comedy teams could create their own universe through pure dialogue. Jack's table had gone quiet. Several people glanced at him, trying to gauge his reaction to being mentioned with such obvious respect. The beautiful thing about this transition, Dick concluded, is that it hasn't replaced radio's lessons. It's built on them. Every successful television comedian today uses techniques pioneered by radio legends. We may work in a different medium, but we're telling the same eternal stories about human nature, about relationships, about the comedy that emerges from everyday life. Dick received strong applause and returned to his table as the evening continued. But Jack's mood had darkened considerably. Being mentioned in Dick's speech felt patronizing to him, as if this television newcomer was graciously acknowledging the pioneers while positioning himself as their superior. As the formal program ended and people began to mingle, Jack's careful public persona began to slip. He stood from the head table with the exaggerated precision of someone who'd had too much to drink but was determined not to show it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jack called out, his voice cutting through the ballroom conversations with that distinctive timing that had made him famous. "May I have your attention for just a moment?" The room gradually quieted as people turned to see what the legendary Jack Benny wanted to say. Dick looked up from his conversation with Mary Tyler Moore, curious but not concerned. "I want to say something about this transition we're celebrating tonight," Jack continued, his voice carrying that measured delivery that had captivated radio audiences for decades. "We've heard a lot of beautiful speeches about evolution, about building on the past, about honoring what came before." Several people nodded approvingly. This sounded like it might be a thoughtful reflection from one of radio's greatest performers. "But I think we need to be honest about something," Jack said, his tone beginning to edge towards something more pointed. "There's a difference between building on a foundation and just benefiting from other people's work. There's a difference between earning success and just being in the right place at the right time with the right face." The room was beginning to sense tension in Jack's words. "Now, I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings," Jack continued, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but I think it's important that we maintain some perspective about what real comedy talent actually looks like." Jack began to pace slightly as he spoke, his movements sharp and calculated. "Take Dick Van Dyke, for example," Jack said, gesturing toward Dick's table with a flourish that felt more attacking than acknowledging. "Everyone's calling him the king of television comedy, praising his talent, talking about how he's revolutionizing entertainment." The ballroom went completely silent. People stopped drinking, stopped talking, stopped moving as they realized they were about to witness a public confrontation. "But let's be honest about what Dick Van Dyke actually represents," Jack continued, his voice getting sharper. "Dick is a TV pretty boy. He's a handsome face with a pleasant personality who happened to get lucky with a good writing team and a medium that rewards appearance over ability." Dick's face remained composed, but something in his eyes was beginning to change. "Has Dick Van Dyke ever had to create comedy with just his voice?" Jack asked rhetorically. "Has he ever had to make an audience laugh without them seeing him, without relying on physical gestures or facial expressions? Has he ever had to build characters entirely through dialogue and timing?" Jack's voice was getting more theatrical, more condescending. "The answer is no. Dick Van Dyke is a television performer who benefits from good lighting, careful camera angles, and editing that can fix any mistakes. He's never been tested under real comedy conditions. Never had to prove he could succeed based purely on talent rather than appearance." Gasps rippled through the crowd. This had crossed from industry commentary into personal attack territory. "Dick Van Dyke is very good at being a TV pretty boy," Jack said with dismissive laughter. "He's charming on screen, he can remember his lines, and he looks good in the suits wardrobe gives him. But that's not real comedy talent. That's just being fortunate enough to have the right look for a medium that values style over substance. Jack looked directly at Dick. So when I hear people calling Dick the future of comedy, when I see him receiving awards for excellence, I have to speak up. Because real comedy excellence requires real skill, real training, real understanding of the craft. And Dick Van Dyke is just a pretty face who got lucky. The silence that followed was unlike anything anyone in that ballroom had ever experienced. 220 people held their breath, waiting to see how Dick Van Dyke would respond to this devastating public attack. Dick stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and calm. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the silent room. "Jack," Dick said simply, "are you finished?" "I'm finished when someone acknowledges the difference between real comedy talent and just being photogenic enough for television," Jack replied, his voice still carrying that distinctive rhythm but with an edge of bitterness. Dick walked to the center of the room, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. His movement was confident, unhurried, like a man who knew exactly what he intended to say. "All right," Dick said, his voice growing stronger. "Let's talk about real comedy talent. Let's talk about what it means to build a career versus tearing others down. And let's talk about the difference between being a professional and being bitter about changes you can't control." Jack crossed his arms, his expression suggesting he was prepared for whatever defense Dick might offer. "Jack, you called me a TV pretty boy," Dick continued. "You suggested that I've succeeded based on appearance rather than ability, that I've never been tested under real comedy conditions, that I don't understand genuine comic craft." Dick looked around the room, making eye contact with various entertainment legends. "Those are serious accusations, and I think everyone here deserves to understand what they really mean." Dick turned back to Jack, his voice becoming more pointed. "First, let's talk about medium transitions and what they actually require. You're absolutely right that radio and television are different mediums. Radio required incredible vocal skills, perfect timing, and the ability to create entire worlds through sound alone. Those are remarkable talents that I deeply respect." Several people in the audience began nodding. "But television doesn't diminish those skills, Jack. It adds to them. Television comedy requires everything radio comedy required, plus physical comedy, visual storytelling, and the ability to sustain character development over multiple seasons. It's not easier than radio, it's different, and in many ways more complex." Dick's voice was gaining strength and authority. "But let's talk about what you really mean when you call me a pretty boy, Jack. What you really mean is that you're frustrated about your own television struggles. What you really mean is that you can't accept that success in one medium doesn't guarantee success in another." The room was completely focused on Dick now. "And that's what really bothers you, isn't it, Jack? It's not that I don't have talent, it's that my talent works in television and yours doesn't." Dick walked closer to Jack, his voice becoming more intimate but somehow more commanding. "You want to talk about real comedy conditions, Jack? Let's talk about them. Let's talk about what happened when you tried to transition your radio show to television." Jack's face began to change color. "Tell them about the first season of the Jack Benny program." "Jack," Dick said quietly. Several people in the audience leaned forward, clearly recognizing this reference. "No? You don't want to tell them?" Dick asked. "Then I will." Dick turned to address the room. When Jack's radio show moved to television in 1950, the transition was difficult. The visual medium exposed problems that had been hidden by radio's purely auditory format. Dick's voice was getting harder now. Jack's legendary stinginess, which was hilarious on radio, came across as genuinely cruel on television. His interactions with Rochester, which worked perfectly as voice-only comedy, looked uncomfortable and problematic when audiences could see the racial dynamics playing out visually. Audible gasps came from several people in the audience. "But that wasn't the real problem, Jack. The real problem was how you handled the criticism." Jack was now visibly shaking. "Instead of adapting your approach for the new medium, you blamed everyone else. You blamed the directors for not understanding your vision. You blamed the writers for not capturing your radio magic. You blamed the network for not supporting you properly. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. And you blamed Rochester, Dick continued, his voice getting more passionate. When critics pointed out that the racial dynamics of your show were problematic on television, instead of addressing the concerns, you made Rochester the scapegoat. Dick's voice was getting louder, more commanding. You told Eddie Anderson that he needed to change his performance, that he was making the show look bad, that his portrayal was causing problems with critics. You blamed him for a situation that was entirely about your inability to adapt to a new medium. Dick walked closer to Jack. And when Rochester tried to discuss the concerns with you, when he suggested ways to update the relationship for television, you told him he was being uppity and that he should be grateful for the work you were giving him. The room was absolutely riveted. That's when Rochester started looking for other work, Jack, not because he didn't appreciate working with you, but because you made it clear that you valued your ego more than his dignity or the show's success. Dick paused, letting his words sink in. You want to know the difference between us, Jack? When my show faces criticism, I listen to it. When directors suggest changes, I consider them. When my co-stars have concerns, I address them. Because I understand that television comedy is collaborative, while you think it's about protecting your radio legacy at everyone else's expense. Dick looked around the room one final time. You called me a pretty boy who got lucky with a good writing team. But you know what good writing teams require, Jack? They require stars who respect their collaborators, who listen to feedback, who understand that the show is bigger than any one performer's ego. Dick turned back to Jack. I didn't get lucky with good writers, Jack. I earned their respect by treating them with the professionalism you never learned. And that's why my television show works while yours struggles, not because I'm prettier than you, but because I'm better at collaboration. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack Benny stood there, his face a mixture of rage, humiliation, and something that might have been recognition of the truth. Then something happened that no one in that ballroom expected. Jack's legs gave out, and he dropped to his knees. At first, people thought he was having some kind of medical episode. Several people moved to help him. But then they realized what was happening. Jack Benny was kneeling, deliberately, in front of Dick Van Dyke, in front of 220 people. You're right, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. God help me, you're right. Dick looked down at this legendary figure on his knees. This man who had defined radio comedy, now reduced to a broken person confronting his own failures. Jack, Dick said gently, get up. I can't, Jack said, tears beginning to stream down his face. I can't get up. What I did to Eddie, how I handled everything. I never thought about how my fear was hurting other people. Yes, you did, Dick said quietly. You knew exactly what you were doing. But Jack, that doesn't mean you can't choose to do better. Dick knelt down beside Jack, bringing himself to eye level. The question isn't whether you've made mistakes, Dick said. The question is what you're going to do now. Jack looked at Dick through his tears. How can I fix this? How can I make it right with Eddie, with everyone I hurt because I was too proud to admit I needed help? You start by acknowledging what you did, Dick said. You stop blaming others for your problems and take responsibility for your choices. You use whatever influence you have left to help people instead of hurting them. Jack nodded shakily. I will. I swear I will. Don't swear to me, Dick said. Swear to Eddie Anderson. Swear to every performer who's ever been blamed for someone else's inability to change with the times. Dick helped Jack to his feet. The room watched in amazement as the two comedians stood facing each other. I need to call Eddie, Jack said, his voice stronger now. I need to apologize properly. Yes, you do, Dick agreed. But Jack, when you call him, don't do it for your own guilt. Do it because he deserved better from you, because he was your partner, and you treated him like an employee you could blame for your own shortcomings. Jack turned to address the room, his voice shaking but clear. Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you all an enormous apology. I owe Dick Van Dyke an enormous apology. and I owe Eddie Anderson the biggest apology of my life." Jack's voice got stronger as he continued. "I came here tonight thinking I was defending the integrity of radio comedy, but I was really just displaying my own fear about being replaced by someone better adapted to change. Dick Van Dyke didn't need to be torn down for me to maintain my relevance. His success didn't diminish my legacy, my own behavior did that." Jack looked directly at Dick. "You're not a TV pretty boy. You're a professional who understands collaboration, adaptation, and treating people with respect. Everything I forgot how to do when I let fear control my decisions." The applause that followed was unlike anything anyone had heard at an industry event. It wasn't just appreciation for entertainment, it was recognition of genuine human transformation happening in real time. Jack turned back to the audience one final time. "I'm going to do better. I'm going to learn from performers like Dick who understand that success comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. And I'm going to spend whatever career I have left trying to earn back the respect I threw away." Over the next several weeks, the story dominated entertainment news. But the real story wasn't about humiliation or confrontation. The real story was about accountability, change, and the possibility that even the most established performers could learn to adapt. Jack did call Eddie Anderson. The conversation lasted hours and was deeply emotional. Jack apologized without making excuses, acknowledged how his fear had led to cruelty, and asked what he could do to make amends. Eddie was gracious but firm. He wanted Jack to publicly acknowledge the problems with their radio dynamic and use his platform to support other performers of color. More importantly, Jack changed his approach to television, focusing on collaboration instead of trying to recreate his radio success. His later TV work was more successful, precisely because he'd learned to adapt rather than resist. Years later, in 1974, Jack Benny was receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award. Dick Van Dyke was the presenter, and their friendship had become one of Hollywood's most unexpected relationships. The story of that night in 1966 became legendary in comedy circles, not because a legend was humiliated, but because two men found a way to turn conflict into growth, resistance into adaptation, and bitterness into mutual respect. Jack Benny really did call Dick Van Dyke a TV pretty boy in front of 220 people. And Dick's response really did put Jack on his knees. But what happened next was something more powerful than public humiliation. It was public redemption that showed even the most successful people can learn to change, adapt, and become better versions of themselves. That's the real lesson of that evening. Not about winning or losing, but about having the courage to grow, the wisdom to adapt, and the grace to help others do the same. But the transformation that began that night had consequences that reached far beyond the entertainment industry. Jack's reconciliation with Eddie Anderson became a model for how other performers could address the racial dynamics that television was making impossible to ignore. 2 weeks after the Beverly Hilton confrontation, Jack called Eddie personally. The conversation was painful but necessary. Eddie had been hurt not just by Jack's treatment during the television transition, but by years of being relegated to a subservient role that had become increasingly uncomfortable as society evolved. "Jack, I loved working with you on radio," Eddie said during their 4-hour phone call. "But when television came along and people could see our interactions instead of just hearing them, it became clear that the relationship wasn't working anymore. And instead of acknowledging that you made it my fault, Jack listened without defending himself. When Eddie finished, Jack said simply, 'You're right. I was scared of changing the dynamic because I thought it would hurt the comedy, but I was wrong to put my comfort ahead of your dignity.'" The reconciliation wasn't just private. 3 months later, Jack appeared on The Tonight Show and publicly acknowledged his mistakes. "I had a great radio show," he told Johnny Carson, "but I nearly destroyed it, trying to force it into a medium where it didn't belong. And in the process, I hurt a good friend and partner who deserved much better from me." That appearance changed how the industry viewed accountability. Other performers began publicly addressing their own problematic content and relationships, using Jack's example as a template for how to handle such situations with grace and honesty. The night at the Beverly Hilton also marked a turning point in how television comedy approached collaboration. Dick's emphasis on treating writers and co-stars as partners rather than employees became the new standard. Shows that operated under the old hierarchical model began changing their approach, and new shows were developed with collaboration built into their structure from the beginning. In 1968, when Dick was developing the new Dick Van Dyke Show, he surprised everyone by asking Jack Benny to guest star in several episodes. The partnership worked beautifully, with Jack's legendary timing complementing Dick's physical comedy in ways that highlighted both performers' strengths. Working with Jack taught me something important, Dick told reporters after their successful collaboration. Experience and innovation don't have to compete with each other. When they work together, they create something neither could achieve alone. Jack's approach to television also evolved dramatically. Instead of trying to recreate his radio success, he began developing material specifically for the visual medium. His later TV specials were among his most successful work precisely because they embraced television's possibilities rather than fighting them. In 1970, Jack was invited to speak at a broadcasting school about the transition from radio to television. His speech became legendary in academic circles for its honest assessment of his own failures and what he'd learned from them. "I spent the first 15 years of television trying to make it into radio with pictures," Jack told the students. But television isn't radio with pictures, it's a completely different art form with its own possibilities and requirements. The performers who succeeded in television were the ones who understood that, while people like me who succeeded despite television were the ones who eventually learned to stop fighting the medium and start working with it. Jack's relationship with Eddie Anderson also evolved into one of Hollywood's most respected partnerships. They continued working together, but in projects where Eddie was credited as a co-creator and equal partner rather than a supporting performer. Their 1973 variety special, Two Old Friends, was both a commercial success and a powerful demonstration of how entertainment relationships could evolve with changing times. When Jack Benny died in 1974, Dick Van Dyke spoke at his memorial service. The eulogy was remarkable for its focus not on Jack's early radio success, but on his willingness to change and grow in his later career. "Jack Benny was one of the greatest comedians who ever lived," Dick told the assembled crowd. But what made him truly special wasn't just his talent. It was his courage to admit when he was wrong, to change when he needed to change, and to put relationships ahead of ego when it mattered most. Dick looked out at the audience, seeing faces of performers from multiple generations who had been influenced by Jack's example. That night in 1966, when I confronted Jack about his treatment of others, I wasn't trying to destroy him. I was trying to save him from destroying himself. And I'm grateful that he had the courage to hear what I was saying, to acknowledge his mistakes, and to spend his final years proving that even the most successful people can learn to be better. Eddie Anderson, who had become one of Jack's closest friends in his final years, also spoke at the service. His words captured the real lesson of the Beverly Hilton confrontation. "Jack hurt me deeply for a long time, but he also showed me that people can change, that accountability is possible, and that friendship can survive even serious mistakes if both people are willing to do the work of rebuilding trust." The Benny Van Dyke model, as it came to be known in industry circles, became a template for resolving conflicts between established performers and emerging talent. Instead of viewing success as a zero-sum game, it demonstrated how different generations could learn from each other and create something better together. In 1985, 20 years after the original confrontation, Dick was honored by the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences for his contributions to comedy. During his acceptance speech, he reflected on the lessons he'd learned from his conflict with Jack Benny. "Jack Benny taught me that confronting someone about their behavior isn't about winning or losing," Dick said. "It's about caring enough about them to tell them the truth, even when that truth is painful. And it's about believing that people can change, that redemption is possible, and that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is refuse to let them continue down a destructive path." The story of Jack Benny calling Dick Van Dyke a TV pretty boy had become more than just an entertainment industry anecdote. It had become a lesson about adaptation, accountability, and the possibility that even the deepest professional conflicts could be resolved through honest confrontation and genuine change. Dick Van Dyke's calm response didn't just put Jack Benny on his knees, it put him on a path to becoming a better person, a better collaborator, and ultimately a better legacy than his early success alone could have provided. That's the real power of standing up for what's right while still believing in people's capacity to change. It doesn't just correct bad behavior in the moment, it creates the possibility for transformation that can influence how entire industries operate. Jack Benny learned that television wasn't failed radio. It was successful television. Dick Van Dyke learned that defending yourself doesn't require destroying others. And Eddie Anderson learned that patience and forgiveness can sometimes lead to relationships that are stronger than they were before the conflict began. Together, they proved that even the most painful confrontations can become the foundation for growth, understanding, and mutual respect. The Beverly Hilton ballroom that night wasn't just the site of a public argument, it was the birthplace of a new model for how people in power could learn to use that power more responsibly. And that lesson is still being learned today. Every time someone chooses accountability over defensiveness, collaboration over competition, and growth over staying stuck in patterns that no longer serve anyone well,